Behind the sermon, behind the polished prayers, behind the confident smile that illuminated stages and screens across the nation, insiders say there existed a secret that many never wanted the public to see. A truth buried beneath years of spiritual language and coated in the soft glow of charisma and religious authority, because while Brian K. preached grace as if it flowed naturally from his soul, some now claim that grace became something far more troubling. Not a gift of mercy, but a tool of influence, a shield, and in some cases, a weapon used to protect behavior that contradicted everything he proclaimed. For years, people packed auditoriums, clung to his every word, and believed deeply in the message he carried. He was a shepherd, a mentor, a father figure in the faith, a spiritual anchor whose sermons felt transformative and whose conferences drew thousands seeking hope, healing, and direction. But according to numerous insiders who witnessed the inner workings of his ministry, the grace Brian spoke of so passionately from the pulpit was allegedly twisted behind closed doors into a mechanism that excused misconduct, silenced critics, and blurred moral boundaries in ways that left many heartbroken and confused. For some, the first shock came when they realized that Brian's teachings about forgiveness were often used to mute accountability. Members report that he would frame questioning or concerns as spiritual rebellion, telling people that doubt was not just unhealthy but sinful, that raising questions against leadership was equivalent to resisting God, and that only those with unwavering trust could truly walk in the blessings he preached about. The very concept of grace, meant to heal, allegedly became a leash. Former congregants describe a culture where the pastor's words defined truth, where financial transparency was minimal, where private meetings replaced open dialogue, and where criticism was spun into evidence of spiritual weakness. They say this was not an isolated behavior, but a pattern. Discomfort was labeled lack of faith, challenges were framed as attacks, and loyalty was equated with righteousness. And this is where the story grows even darker, because according to these sources, it wasn't just emotional pressure, it was spiritual manipulation, disguised beneath sermons that sounded empowering, but subtly trained the congregation to surrender critical thinking. One insider recalls questioning a ministry expense and being pulled aside privately where Brian allegedly told them, "Faith trusts where grace leads. If you can't trust the leadership, you're not trusting God," a statement that felt less like guidance and more like a warning wrapped in spiritual language. Others claim that teachings around giving were directly tied to divine favor, that prosperity theology was preached in a way that linked obedience and tithing to personal blessings, making financial contribution not an act of voluntary faith, but a test of loyalty. Meanwhile, any hesitation to give or question church spending was quietly portrayed as spiritual immaturity or even moral deficiency. It wasn't just about money. Reports suggest that moral concerns were dismissed with the same technique. When members expressed discomfort about behaviors they observed among leadership, lavish spending, questionable associations, or ethically ambiguous decisions, they were told that grace covers all and that true submission meant trusting without seeing, believing without questioning, and forgiving without accountability. Grace became conditional, contingent upon silence and unwavering allegiance. Questioning, no matter how sincere, became a signal of rebellion. This spiritual redefinition of grace allegedly created an environment where members lived in a painful blend of admiration and fear, devotion and guilt. Sermons reinforced obedience while masking control. Private conversations echoed manipulation cloaked in spiritual authority. Insiders say people became afraid to trust their own judgment, believing that God himself was disappointed in their doubts. And while the pastor's public persona was one of humility, compassion, and holiness, behind the scenes, former members describe a world where spiritual authority was used to protect personal indulgence, financial opacity, and internal inconsistencies. Early warning signs included unusual financial practices, leaders asking members to sow seeds for vague causes, secret meetings explained away as spiritual strategy sessions, and a growing divide between what was preached and what was practiced. Congregants reported that those who attempted to confront issues were gradually isolated, subtly rebuked, or manipulated into believing that their concerns were spiritually dangerous. And as the years progressed, the pattern allegedly intensified: more pressure, more guilt, more emphasis on loyalty, and more sermons that subtly redirected suspicion back onto the congregation instead of the leadership. What began as whispers eventually grew into a chorus of concerns, a pattern too consistent and too painful to ignore. This is more than a scandal. It is a cautionary tale about how spiritual language, when placed in the wrong hands, can be used to control, silence, and manipulate people who enter the church only seeking love, belonging, and truth. And in the next section, we will unravel how those early warning signs grew into full-fledged allegations, how the use of grace allegedly became a system of control, and why so many insiders now believe that this story reveals one of the most unsettling truths about spiritual power. When unchecked, it can blind even the most faithful. Stay with me, because what comes next will not only expose what many never saw but may also change how you view spiritual authority forever. Brian Kay's charisma, insiders say, was so disarming and so meticulously polished that early warning signs often slip by unnoticed, buried beneath his warm smile, persuasive sermons, and the comforting belief that a spiritual leader could never misuse the very doctrine he preached with conviction, because publicly Brian taught humility, kindness, sacrifice, and forgiveness. But privately, inconsistencies began collecting like shadows gathering around a bright lamp, subtle at first, then unmistakable as whispered stories surfaced about lavish indulgences, questionable spending habits, and private meetings where grace, the central theme of his message, was invoked selectively, allegedly to protect the pastor while discouraging inquiry from the people who trusted him most. By the time several members began comparing notes, a chilling pattern emerged, revealing that the spiritual guidance they believed to be holy, pure, and divinely inspired was sometimes being used as a screen to mask morally ambiguous behavior and indulgence inconsistent with the teachings of the church. And what stunned insiders most was not just the alleged misconduct, but how skillfully grace, a doctrine meant to bring freedom, healing, and hope, had been repurposed into justification for secrecy and control, effectively transforming one of Christianity's most liberating principles into a shield against accountability. This early phase laid the groundwork for a deeper, more troubling controversy, one involving allegations of deliberate sin, lifestyle choices in stark contrast to the message preached from the pulpit, and a pattern of manipulation that insiders claim continued for years, concealed behind smiles, sermons, and the magnetic presence of a leader people desperately wanted to trust. As whispers grew louder and suspicions matured into documented concerns, a disturbing narrative unfolded. The pastor who spoke eloquently of purity, sacrifice, and moral conviction on stage was allegedly living a drastically different life behind closed doors. According to former church members, volunteers, and even staff who once admired him deeply, Brian Kay's private choices contradicted his public teaching so dramatically that many were left wrestling with heartbreak, confusion, and betrayal. Financial indulgence was the first red flag. Sources describe a lifestyle filled with luxury vehicles, expensive properties, high-end trips, and personal upgrades funded in ways that members, had they known the details, would have found difficult to reconcile with the ministry's call for humility and sacrificial giving. Insiders claim that church donations were sometimes directed into personal ventures or opulent purchases that were never fully disclosed to congregants, creating a financial secrecy structure hidden under sermons about trusting God with your giving and sowing into good soil. Yet money was only the beginning. Insiders also allege that Brian engaged in personal behaviors starkly inconsistent with the moral standards that he publicly endorsed, behaviors that would have been condemned if committed by a member of the congregation. Although exact details remain sensitive, multiple sources describe a pattern of willful indulgence, choices that contradicted the image of righteousness projected on stage. When questions arose, grace was used as a shield, a spiritual cushion that neutralized confrontation. Staff members say that whenever someone expressed concern, Brian allegedly redirected the conversation by saying things like, "Grace covers all," or "You don't understand the calling on my life," statements that reframed criticism as spiritual immaturity and positioned him as uniquely protected by God's favor. This strategy, insiders say, was subtle, calculated, and devastatingly effective. If you questioned him, you weren't just questioning a man, you were questioning God's chosen vessel. Those who attempted to confront discrepancies were quietly isolated, rebuked, or marked as spiritually weak. Grace, meant to bring liberation, had become a mechanism for suppression. Even his sermons, which outwardly championed humility, forgiveness, and righteousness, allegedly served a dual purpose, bolstering his public image while subtly conditioning members to equate obedience with holiness. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, staff meetings and private conversations reportedly shifted toward themes of loyalty tests, strategic silence, and the expectation that those closest to the pastor must protect the ministry at all costs. Over time, congregants began noticing that the standards demanded of them were far stricter than the standards applied to leadership. Rules appeared selectively enforced. Behavior that would have sent a member into disciplinary counseling was excused or ignored when committed by someone in authority. Some insiders go so far as to say that the entire ministry operated like a carefully choreographed narrative. Every public appearance, sermon, and social post meticulously crafted to preserve an image of spiritual excellence while personal inconsistencies remained shielded behind rhetoric about grace, calling, and divine favor. For many members, the resulting emotional conflict was overwhelming. They loved their pastor, believed in the church's mission, and felt spiritually nourished by the sermons, yet they couldn't deny the growing dissonance between what they witnessed privately and what they were told publicly. As doubt spread quietly, small acts of resistance formed. Some began documenting inconsistencies, others sought outside counsel, and a few attempted to create accountability structures. But almost every time concerns were raised, the response relied on the same spiritual framing, that questioning leadership was equivalent to doubting God's will, that discomfort was evidence of spiritual immaturity, and that unity mattered more than transparency. Experts on religious organizations warn that when a leader is elevated as morally superior, divinely protected, or spiritually untouchable, followers often suppress their own intuition and ignore clear warning signs. And according to insiders, that is exactly what happened here. Brian Kay's alleged use of grace wasn't just a theological misinterpretation, it became a system of influence, a structure that discouraged scrutiny, normalized indulgence, and maintained control, all while cloaked in the beautiful language of faith. And now, as this investigation unfolds, it becomes clearer than ever that when spiritual power, charisma, and authority merge without accountability, the results can be as destructive as they are heartbreaking. As tensions continued mounting behind the scenes of the ministry, the cracks in the carefully polished facade began widening in ways that could no longer be ignored. With staff turnover quietly increasing, longtime members whispering their discomfort, and an uneasy awareness spreading that the very spiritual principles meant to inspire faith, unity, and emotional healing, grace, forgiveness, humility, and spiritual authority were allegedly being weaponized to shield questionable decisions and personal choices, creating a cycle of silence and control that threatened the spiritual stability, emotional well-being, and integrity of the entire church community. Yet the public, blissfully unaware of the turmoil happening just beyond the spotlight, continued seeing only the confident, charismatic Brian Kay delivering powerful sermons about divine favor, spiritual breakthrough, and unwavering hope. But every hidden pattern reaches a tipping point, and for this congregation, the quiet murmurs that had existed for years eventually erupted into a full-scale internal awakening. What began as scattered concerns, hushed conversations, and uneasy glances evolved into a groundswell of documented discrepancies and troubling testimonies. Staff members had begun keeping records, financial inconsistencies, decisions that made no sense, private behaviors contradicting public teachings, and conversations where questions were dismissed using the soft but suffocating language of grace. Members who attempted private dialogue found themselves met not with transparency but with spiritual framing. You're misunderstanding God's plan. Faith means trusting, not doubting. Grace covers us. Focus on your own spiritual growth. Answers that were soothing on the surface but strategically designed to discourage accountability and shut down inquiry. Over time, these reassurances began to feel hollow, and the psychological toll on the congregation grew heavier. In private, people described feeling spiritually manipulated, emotionally pressured, and trapped in an environment where loyalty to leadership mattered more than truth. Former staff members recounted tense, late-night meetings where loyalty was demanded, questions were discouraged, and anyone who persisted in raising concerns was subtly marginalized, labeled as spiritually weak, rebellious, or out of alignment with the vision. The turning point became undeniable when multiple individuals trying to understand church finances discovered that crucial information, expense details, budgets, and personal allowances, was being tightly controlled by an inner circle. Those who asked questions were told that only leadership can see God's plan, another spiritual barrier preventing accountability. Meanwhile, Brian Kay's public persona remained immaculate. His sermons streamed online to thousands, polished messages celebrating love, redemption, and heavenly blessing, creating a public image of humility and righteousness that clashed painfully with what insiders claimed to witness behind closed doors. The tension between appearance and reality reached a point where congregants began experiencing emotional dissonance, admiring the pastor they saw on stage while questioning the leader they saw in private. Then came the first subtle wave of public exposure, whispers on social media, anonymous testimonies, speculation on forums, and investigative Christian blogs highlighting recurring patterns: lavish spending, secrecy in financial dealings, personal behavior inconsistent with church teachings, and reliance on sermons that condemned doubt and glorified obedience. As scrutiny grew, internal chaos intensified, emergency meetings were held, staff were urged to stay loyal, and carefully crafted emails assured the congregation that everything was fine, even as tension thickened behind the scenes. Some insiders described the environment as paranoid, with leadership extremely aware that any leak could damage the church's image and the pastor's influence. The dramatic breaking point came when a group of longtime members, exhausted by silence and armed with documented evidence, organized a collective confrontation, presenting leadership with a list of inconsistencies, financial questions, and moral concerns. Instead of providing clarity or accountability, insiders say the response was orchestrated like a performance. Brian addressed the congregation not with specifics, but with sweeping sermons about forgiveness, unity, spiritual warfare, and the danger of division, subtly framing dissenters as spiritually compromised. One attendee described the scene as almost surreal, saying, "He spoke with such authority that for a moment you doubted what your own eyes had seen. Grace wasn't being preached, it was being used as a shield." It was in that moment that many insiders realized the pattern could no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding or isolated mistakes. It was a full crisis. As more people came forward, the disparity between the church's public message and its internal behavior became too overwhelming to contain. Whistleblowers surfaced, describing loyalty tests, selective forgiveness, and the emotionally suffocating message that questioning leadership equaled questioning God Himself. Others shared stories of intimidation, subtle threats, and being pushed out of the community for raising concerns. The narrative of spiritual leadership had collided head-on with allegations of manipulation, creating a reckoning the church could no longer avoid. And as insiders continued speaking out, the story shifted from quiet discomfort to a full-scale spiritual, emotional, and organizational crisis, one that revealed how easily faith can be manipulated when power is left unchecked, and how deeply people can be wounded when grace, the very doctrine meant to heal the broken, is allegedly transformed into a tool that protects the powerful rather than the vulnerable.